Thanks. The intention here was that I'm going to present Sarah and I are going to present the sort of first section of the report. So I hope you all have copies of the report now. The format of the report is that we tried to decide to do something slightly different this time. So the first half of the report is by UK and a Changing Europe, as it were, that is to say the core team, and in particular myself, Sarah, and Stephen Hunsaker from the team. And the second half of the report is a compilation of chapters on individual policy areas and issues from our contributing academics, most of whom you're going to hear from in the course of today. But we thought that rather than simply having a report with compiling academics' views on those policy issues, we should try and frame it by stepping back a bit and taking a look at the current state of the UK economy, both how we got here, what's happened over the last 15 years or so, and where we are now. So the first half consists both of that retrospective look and the assessing the current state in what I've described as a SWOT framework. And while the SWOT thing sounds a bit management consultants from the 1980s, I know, and people have said that to me on Twitter, not unreasonably, I think it's actually quite a good frame in which to think about the current position of the UK economy, particularly because it sort of avoids what I think is one of the traps that current discourse somewhat falls into about the UK economy. That is to say, some of the mood almost across the political spectrum is a bit, well, first of all, the UK economy is in absolutely terrible shape. We've had a bad 15 years. Everything's doom and gloom. And first of all, and then second, and what's more, there's little or nothing we can do about it because we are, from an economic perspective, trapped by variously the fiscal position, by the fact that we have a unsatisfactory Brexit deal, but which politically it's impossible to amend in any serious way, and by other longer-term structural factors like demographics, for example. And I think if you take the view both that A, things are really pretty shit, and B, there's nothing we can do about it, you obviously end up talking yourselves into what in the report I described as a sort of a doom loop. And while, as I'll say in a minute, we do have, indeed have plenty of problems to be getting on with, things aren't quite as bad as all that. And seeing the position of the UK economy through a SWOT framework forces you to be a bit more rigorous and think about not only what's gone wrong, not only about your weaknesses, but about your strengths, not only about threats, but opportunities. And that's what we've tried to do. So, with that preamble, let me start by talking about where we are now. First of all, and much of this, of course, will be familiar to many of you, but I think it's helpful to both look at it again and put it in some sort of context. So, productivity. And I think it's worth remembering that UK productivity performance in the run-up to the financial crisis was pretty good. Both in absolute terms, it was sort of pretty good in the sense it was consistent with historic norms, but historic norms, for the last, since World War II, were pretty good. Here's Sarah. And actually, it was very good compared to other European and indeed other advanced economies all round. As you can see here, the blue line, the dark line here on these charts and on subsequent charts is the UK, The other lines are other G7 countries. And you can see there that UK performance, and in fact, if you take this chart back to 1979, you see a pretty similar pattern. Some of you may remember the work by Dan Corrie and John Van Reenen looking at this in the late 2000s. So I wouldn't say the UK had a productivity miracle, but it did actually pretty well. That, of course, has changed productivity performance since the global financial crisis has been pretty dismal. Although, as this chart shows, it is not abnormally dismal by the standards of other G7 countries. And this is, I think, a sort of continuing theme in any sort of analysis that looks back at the last 15 years. Our performance has not been that different from other large advanced European economies, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, a little bit better over most of the period than Italy, which has well-known problems, a little bit worse than France and Germany at various times, but not disastrously so. So the UK the performance has certainly not been good, but it's not been uniquely bad either. And on employment, actually, the UK's performance has been actually rather good. So this is employment rates. Employment rates in the UK have been relatively high for now quite a long time, since the 2000s. But performed quite strongly after the global financial crisis, boosted by both an influx of relatively younger workers from the EU with high labour force participation rates, and by increasing labour force participation, particularly among older workers, people over the age of 50. And I think the older worker story up until the pandemic was actually one of the less publicized and more encouraging things, both from a sort of overall economic performance, but also from a social perspective as well. It was actually, the UK did very well. That performance, we did experience some drop-off after the pandemic, in the sense, a relative drop-off, in the sense that our employment rates don't appear to have recovered as strongly as other countries. It's difficult to say, particularly given the data issues around employment, measuring employment, whether this is a negative structural change. That is to say, whether the reduction in labour force participation, particularly among people who self-describe as sick or disabled, whether that is a persistent phenomenon or just a temporary one. So that is an open question. I don't think it's necessarily, again, as black as it is often painted. One thing that has, however, been consistent throughout the sort of living economic history, as it were, is investment. Investment remains low, has been low for a very long time, reflecting a combination of both low public investment and low private investment. And while, again, there are issues around measurement, and again, you might argue that being a much more service-intensive economy than, say, Germany, that the UK possibly requires less measured fixed capital formation to grow. Nonetheless, I think there's some degree of consensus that this is a structural problem. And here, then, we have another sort of relative success story, which is the migration statistics and the recent rise in migration, which began in the 2010s and then continued in the 2000. Began in the 1990s, continued in the 2000s, and intensified even in the last few years. Sorry, I think that's I put in the wrong slide there. I meant to show the most recent data, which, as you will probably know, shows record levels of migration in the last few years, something we'll be talking about later in the day. But from an economic perspective, on the whole, this has boosted both labour force participation and GDP overall, even if the impacts on productivity per worker are more ambiguous. The deficit and the fiscal position. So this shows both the level of the deficit and public sector net investment. And you can see obviously the sharp rise in the deficit after the global financial crisis and its steady reduction during the period of austerity, of fiscal consolidation in the 2010s, after which it spiked up during the pandemic and remains at what by historical standards is relatively high levels. So at the same time, public sector net investment, which fell after the global financial crisis, has picked up a bit, but still remains at levels which I think most of us consider to be well below the optimum. And going forward, a significant part of further deficit reduction comes from reductions in public sector net investment, as well as from fiscal projections on spending on public services, which I think virtually all analysts regard as wholly unrealistic. So there is a clear fiscal constraint in the sense that the deficit, while by no means out of control, still remains relatively high. Pressure on public services is probably higher than it's ever been, and given that the current projections, which show relatively modest reductions to the deficit, are predicated both on some degree of further tax rises and spending cuts, which are wholly unrealistic, none of this really quite adds up. Of course, that doesn't mean there is no money left, and it doesn't mean that there aren't perfectly feasible things that one could do from an economic perspective to get out of this bind. The problem is the interaction of those fiscal constraints with and the economic constraints which follow from that, with the political constraints of a political system which seems to have got itself into a mode where the view appears to be that our tax burden, although it's still only middle of the pack by advanced economy standards, is too high, and no one can say that it ought to go up a bit, at the same time as saying that public services, there is no real scope for scaling back the role of the state in any meaningful way. But we will talk more about that later. So that's the sort of state of the economy. And again, I hope that the perception there is, we've had a mediocre 15 years, but none of the graphs that I've just shown ought to give rise to, ought to make us panic, as opposed to saying there are some fairly long-term structural problems here, problems which I think have been exacerbated, problems which are long-standing, like the lack of investment, and more recently exacerbated both by the macro and microeconomic damage inflicted by austerity and subsequently by Brexit. But there's no one cause, nor does it all add up to a situation that should lead us to despair, but rather to say we need to find some ways out of this. So having said that, I will now proceed to sort of analyze the current state of the economy and to start by looking, well, given all this, what are the strengths of the UK economy? What can we say positive about this picture? And there are some important strengths here. First of all, people. It's just, I think, a truism to say that the strength of an economy rests primarily on the population and labor force of a country. To the extent that you can back that up with economic analysis, the ONS's own analysis of the value of human capital in the UK far exceeds the value of fixed capital investment. That is to say, I think the estimate of the value of human capital is somewhere in the region of 10 or 12 times annual GDP, whereas the estimate of the value of other forms of investment is only 4 times GDP or so. So from an economic perspective, as well as a sort of human perspective, it's people that matters most. And we're not doing too badly. We have the expansion of the university sector has meant that there's been a growing share of graduate level skills in the workforce as a whole. And the UK school system over the last 20 years has improved quite remarkably. That's both true but looking at our own data, but also by looking at PISA scores. So compared to other advanced economies, the UK school system has clearly improved quite significantly. It's also, while there is still a significant inequality, that is to say, socioeconomic gradient in educational attainment, it's less than it was. So we have both a better and a somewhat more equal education system. We also have a flexible labour market. It's by no means perfect, as Tony Wilson's chapter sets out. But on the whole, the UK labour market does reasonably well in getting people into jobs. And the employment rate, as I showed before, remains high. So on the whole, this represents something of a strength. We also have relatively robust institutions, despite some of what's happened in the last few years. We have, from an economic perspective, the Bank of England, the Office of Budget Responsibility are independent, competent, well-regarded and professional. Similarly, on the microeconomic side, the Competitions and Markets Authority is still regarded as a first-tier competition authority. So we have robust economic institutions that generally command credibility domestically and internationally. In looking at different sectors within the UK economy, we have a number of high productivity service sectors, and importantly, that's not just the financial sector. Some of you may have seen the recent analysis by Dan Davies, subsequently covered in the FT, of the so-called other business service sector of the UK economy, which covers a whole multitude of things, including consultancy, legal services, architecture, accountancy, and so on, which are both our largest and in absolute terms our fastest growing export sector. We are not the UK economy is not just a sort of very highly paid, highly productive financial services sector in London with a backward rest of the economy. There are actually other high productivity service sectors that are increasingly important and arguably more important for the medium to long run than the financial sector. That in turn, those sectors are symbiotic with another high productivity service sector, which is the university sector. So the university sector is itself both an export sector and, of course, is an essential part of the ecosystem which produces the high productivity services in the first place, because it provides the skilled labor pool as well as, in some sectors, spin-offs and so on that feed that sector. This is, as I say, once again, not just a finance story. This is a much bigger story and an increasingly large share of the UK economy. And then we have, again, somewhat slightly understated, because it is sort of fortuitous. It's not because of anything we've done, to deserve it, as it were, but it is nonetheless an important strength, which is the use of English, and related to that, the use of common law for contracts for much of international trade, which again gives the UK and London a structural advantage. On the other hand, though, we must also take a hard look at our weaknesses, which I think are probably reasonably familiar. On the people and labour market side, everything I just said about the improvement in the overall skills level of the labour force is true, but that doesn't mean we remains the fact that for the 50% of people who don't go to university, the UK does rather poorly in delivering skills, training, and hence labour market outcomes. We still have, despite decades of beating ourselves up about the problem of what the career path and what the government's role is in facilitating career paths for people who don't go to university, we've still failed to come up with a coherent answer there, and I think that is remains a big challenge. There also remain structural inequalities in the labour market, and I think most strongly and most obvious, related to what I've just said, is our failure to do very well in terms of improving the education for people who don't live in cities from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds. We've done extremely well in improving the quality of education in London and in some other cities and some other areas around the country for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. We've done much less well outside of those areas in reducing those inequalities. And structural inequalities persist in the labour market across a number of dimensions: socioeconomic status, race, gender, and so on. And then finally, fertility and demographics. And this is an interesting one, actually, because there are points here on both sides. Some of you may have seen the population projections published yesterday, which show, and the headline in the Times today said, UK population forecast to soar above 70 million by 2026. As I pointed out, and which was then the subject of a short article in the FT, these projections are, in fact, don't take account of the recent quite sharp decline in fertility. They actually assume that fertility suddenly recovers, in fact, suddenly recovered in the middle of last year, despite the fact that there's no evidence whatsoever to support this, and the number of births jumps back by about 50,000 a year. So they're completely wrong. There should be no doubt about this. The fertility projections that underlie population projections are wrong. But it is true that migration will shore up the rate of population growth overall, but even that will still not enough to mitigate the aging of the population. And I think that is the sort of key challenge here, is you have a population in common with almost all other advanced economies, which without migration both sees a shrinking working age population and a rapidly increasing elderly and very elderly population, and an even more rapidly shrinking population of kids. Now, you can mitigate that with migration to some extent, and that indeed is what we're doing, but that, of course, has its own political, social, and economic challenges, and doesn't in itself address the question of how you necessarily, of how you support the people who are over 75 or indeed over 85. Second, institutions. And I think here there's sort of a slight paradox which comes out interestingly from our analysis, and those are some of the chapters, is that the UK is at the same time both extremely centralized by the standards of advanced economies in the way the political system works and in the way that the and fiscally, right? So London, even though London has a lot more powers than it did 30 years ago, it still has a lot less powers than most other capital cities, in other advanced economies, and that's even more the case for other cities and municipalities around the UK. So that's, in one sense, might be a constraint on growth, the fact that we have a much more centralized system in terms of powers and fiscal centralization. But on the other hand, we also are, as everyone knows, incredibly NIMBY-ish. That is to say, we allow local interests, to block both the provision of housing and other infrastructure. We devolve vetoes on development really rather remarkably to local areas in a way which, again, many other countries don't. So we managed, in some sense, to get the worst of both worlds in terms of the way that we allocate some of the powers that determine the pace of economic development. Second, short-termist and erratic governance. I think that's been particularly obvious for the past few years. While I think we might have hoped that that was a sort of a Brexit phenomenon that would that wouldn't persist, I think there are reasons for worrying that it may not it may be more to it than that. Just to take an example of what I mean, on my own topic of migration, I actually thought that the measures that the government, the headline measure that the government recently announced in terms of increasing the salary threshold for the skilled work visa, had a perfectly good economic rationale, at least from the perspective that, you're supposed to have a system that's targeting relatively highly paid or high skilled migration. The salary thresholds have been set at a relatively low point, and since then, nominal pay has increased by quite a lot. So that makes a perfectly good case for updating them. Fine. The way the government did it, however, with announcing it, an announcement rushed out before Christmas, no detail, no consultation with the affected sectors, no impact, economic or indeed any other serious impact assessment, was calculated to increase uncertainty both for businesses and employers on the one hand and workers and potential migrants on the other. Just a sort of textbook example of how not to do policy. So you've got an example there of where actually the underlying policy objective and direction was not crazy, but the way it was done was sort of positively designed in such a way as to undermine business confidence and investment, and that's clearly a bad way to run things. And then public services, I don't need to say any more about that because I think we all know what's happening there. And I think, what we have there is a combination both of underfunding, but also, as Patrick Dunleavy sets out, falling public sector stagnant or falling public sector productivity, in a way which I think, a few years ago, many of us would say was just driven by standard Baumol cost effects, but now clearly reflects something more than that in terms of both underinvestment, poor management, and so on. And that in turn contributes to where we are now. And finally, a sort of long tail of low productivity firms. I think this is well-trodden ground. The UK has plenty of world-leading firms in a number of sectors, but it also has quite a lot of firms in most sectors, but especially in the non-tradable services sector, where productivity remains stubbornly low. So I'm going to hand over now to Sarah to do a bit more of the forward-looking stuff and saying, what does this mean in terms of threats and opportunities?
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, so in terms of opportunities, broadly we think there are opportunities largely stemming from the fact that a significant part of global economic growth in the future is likely to come from high productivity services. And as Jonathan has set out, that's an area of comparative advantage for the UK. And also, building on Jonathan's last point, we think there's opportunity for catch-up growth. So what I want to do is go through 4 main opportunities that we set out in the report. So the first one is catch-up growth. So this is a little bit of a paradox, but given the UK's recent poor productivity performance, particularly in terms of the tail of productivity, and also geographically lower productivity beyond London in particular and the southeast, there's some scope to catch up both in terms of sectoral catch-up in terms of productivity, but also regional catch-up. So, for example, there's a lot of great research out there that examines the comparative productivity of Manchester, Birmingham and Edinburgh compared to, say, French second cities, and the differences are quite stark. In terms of sectorally, why do we think that there might be an opportunity here? Essentially, because of the lower productivity within the UK recently, you can think of the UK as falling further behind the technology frontier. So that means that actually if we could sort of catch up, not necessarily be the sort of absolute global pioneer in any area, not trying to develop leading edge innovations, there's scope there, we think, for growth through enhanced productivity. And indeed, when you think about second and third cities, just bringing these up in terms of productivity to a national average would have quite a significant improvement. The second area that we want to draw attention to as an opportunity lies in high productivity services. And this does include financial services, as Jonathan has said, and that's an area that has maintained its status rather more than initial expectations anticipated at the point of the UK's departure from the EU. But it also involves, as Jonathan said, and as we saw in the news in the past week, advanced business services, legal services, accountancy services, consulting, IT. And here you can see the dominance of service exports in the UK compared to other G7 economies. And quite a lot of the work we've been doing at UK and Changing Europe has been looking at the differential trade impacts of Brexit on services and manufacturing. And you see the UK's strengths in services coming through in that research. We also think that there are some new service areas where the UK could develop and further enhance a comparative advantage. And here we draw attention to services working towards a net zero transition and green economic growth, and also draw attention to advanced technical services and AI. And I think we see the interest in these sectors when you look at regulatory announcements and regulatory changes made by the government in the past 2 years in particular. You see a focus on regulations aimed at stimulating green growth in services and AI. I think a word of caution here, though, is that clearly these are not opportunities that are unique to the UK. And so positioning the UK's regulatory frameworks in these areas carefully in relation to particularly the US and the EU is going to be really important, so that you're not imposing additional regulatory burdens and costs on firms. And I'm drawing attention here to the sort of regulatory and policy framework around the green transition and AI. They're quite exciting areas, I think, in terms of regulatory development, because it's essentially developing almost a rule book from scratch. So there are real opportunities there, but it needs to be done cognizant of what is going on beyond the UK. So the third area of opportunity that we see focuses specifically on net zero and the energy transition. And again, here, I think the UK has gone further and faster than some other countries. So, for example, the UK has been a leader in many ways in the overall progress towards decarbonisation. and in particular policy areas, so particularly in terms of offshore wind, for example. But then you do see it stalling in other areas. So here I think the rollout of electric vehicles, the availability of batteries, the charging infrastructure for that sector, regulations around the components of electric vehicles is an area where you see some of this opportunity stalling slightly. Again, I would draw attention to the importance of placing this debate within the UK in the international context. Clearly, the US and the EU see these as an opportunity too, through the US Inflation Reduction Act and the EU's Net Zero Industry Act. And I think the UK needs to recognise that it is a smaller player within that kind of macroeconomic political arena. And given that, to really harness the opportunities here, I think the UK needs to make more of a virtue of being smaller and potentially more nimble, particularly in terms of its regulatory frameworks and its policy decision making. I think the UK needs to recognise where it sits within the sort of broader politics of that opportunity. And the fourth area of opportunity that we see lies in deepening trade links, particularly with high growth countries. So, one of the sort of big opportunities that was set out around Brexit was that the UK would be able to develop its own trade policy. And a lot has been made of kind of focusing on countries such as the US. I think we need to be realistic about what the US is likely or unlikely to offer in terms of trade. But there are scope with some rapidly emerging economies, particularly if you focus on the UK's comparative advantages in high productivity services. I would stress here, though, that I think there's scope for the UK to be clearer on what its services trade strategy is. So I think if you recognise that services is a key strategic economic strength of the UK and also one that's very strong in terms of tradable services, it would make sense to have a clearer services trade strategy to really try and harness these opportunities. That being said, I think there are some quite interesting innovations in some of the trade agreements that the UK has struck. So particularly in terms of how data and digital services are being handled in trade agreements, I think that's an area where the UK's demonstrated some innovation, if you think about the Japan deal, for example. And then also looking at other types of trade agreements in a very broad way. So here I think the mutual recognition agreement between the UK and Switzerland on financial services is interesting because it's using a different method or mode really of granting access to each other's markets, a regulatory deference model, but it is quite innovative. And so I think sort of being innovative around services trade and being realistic about what the UK's strategy for services trade is important here. We have set this up as a SWOT analysis, and I did see some debate on Twitter that SWOT was a very dated term, but I see we're running with it. So I'll now move on to the final section, which is threats. And Jonathan's already highlighted some of these. I think from the start, I'd just like to say that many of these are not unique to the UK, but they come with a sort of distinctive UK twist or a UK flavour. There are three that I'd like to draw attention to, and the first is the wider global context that the UK is operating in. So here the key point is that the UK now finds itself in a very different geopolitical world to the one in which it left the EU or the one in which it experienced COVID even. It's a period where we seem to be seeing a rise of protectionism, trends towards deglobalization, more instability in terms of supply chains. I think this is particularly stark for the UK because in many ways the UK has always been a very outwardly looking economy. A lot of the domestic economy is comparatively small compared to, say, the US. So I think the UK, this is a key challenge for the UK. It's not at all alone in this. I think I'd draw attention particularly to concerns over the US-China relationship and potential for conflict around Taiwan. And I think you can't discuss this without recognising that this year is a year of a number of very significant elections globally, which are likely, I think, to potentially exacerbate this challenge. I think where the unique British twist on this issue comes is that outside of the EU or outside of a large trading bloc, the UK could find itself quite isolated and a little bit out in the cold. So I think thinking through where the UK sits in this changing geopolitical landscape is a key issue. The second set of threats relate to the UK's infrastructure for institutions and making policy. And I think there's two challenges here. One is a challenge around short-termism. So, as Jonathan said, many of the issues that the UK economy faces are quite long-standing in nature. So, regional inequality, a persistent productivity issue are not new issues. But our political system favours, in many ways, more short-term thinking in terms of policy making. That then becomes a bit of a vicious circle because short-term issues are dealt with in the short term, which further hampers productivity improvements, which means that your revenue position remains relatively weak, and so you end up sort of putting more and more sticking plasters on an issue. I think we really see this at the moment in terms of pressures on public services. And the new deal for the NHS work plan that both parties seem committed to would require significant increases in public spending. It's not clear where that's coming from fiscally. I think the other kind of more persistent issue, which hasn't got a long-term solution at the moment, is around the higher education sector, and particularly given the strengths that Jonathan identified for that sector. We've seen quite a lot in the news recently about its growing reliance on international students. You know, addressing that is a thorny issue. Either, you know, one way would be to increase the public subsidy, another would be to load more debt on young graduates, neither of which are politically attractive, so difficult longer-term decisions need to be made there. So the first set of sort of institutional challenges lies around short-termism, and then the second lies around the sort of paradoxical nature of, you know, strong Westminster and Whitehall control in some areas, particularly around the sort of devolution and the control for regional cities, but then highly localised decision-making in other areas, and planning would be the big example here. So areas where a sort of more national approach and strategy might help in terms of growth are currently devolved locally. And then similarly, policy areas that might help second, third tier cities tend to be concentrated in London. So I think there's a challenge there. And then the third threat that we wanted to draw attention to relates to demographics. And Jonathan has alluded to this. So the UK isn't alone in facing this challenge at all, and it's much more, in many ways, it's much more long term. But I think this chart kind of shows what might be coming down the tracks in terms of, you know, an ageing population places more demands on already overstretched public services, and in that sort of scenario, you'd also be looking at smaller working age population and associated smaller tax take. So I think addressing this, and particularly given the way in which the UK voting system in many ways supports older voters, sort of turning this situation round to support the young, the poor and those with children remains one of the big challenges in terms of fostering longer term growth and productivity for the UK. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So we've got about 10 minutes before the next session, so I'll take any questions or comments from the audience. Just before that, I would like, if please try and ask sort of general questions as opposed to something that will be covered in the subsequent sessions. So I don't want to sort of preempt discussions, for example, of the detail of the tax and welfare system, which we're having in the next session. But any sort of comments, observations, or questions relating to more general issues, we'll take now. Over here first. Over there.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentations. My name is Robert Smith. I work for a law firm, so I'm not an economist, but just a general question about the productivity issues that you highlighted. With all things being equal, and if our productivity has been high, so not productivity, the investment question. So if productivity has been high, employment levels reasonably strong, is there any economic reason for the low levels of investment, or is it just purely a political decision?
I think, so public investment is, it has partly, obviously, the relatively low levels of public are partly a fiscal decision. So yes, a political decision. We could have had higher public investment, but I think there's also a sense in which the way that the system, the planning and system and planning and procurement works, sort of militates against public. So even when, at the height of austerity, when George Osborne was cutting various bits of the public services, there was still, ostensibly at least, a strategy to increase public investment. But often a lot of that money simply didn't get spent because of delays in securing the relevant planning permission and so on. We've seen that obviously with HS2, where not only are we spending more than we originally planned for, but we're spending it rather more slowly and delivering rather less. And there was some interesting research. There's been, I think, several papers published in the last year or so showing that compared to, and here's something where we unlike some of the other things that we mentioned, where compared to other advanced European economies, we do seem to be remarkably inefficient at building stuff, which I think is a serious worry and a serious policy challenge, although arguably in the same way that Sarah just said, potentially an opportunity. Sarah, do you?
I know, I don't have anything.
I think on private investment, the more positive angle would be, I think, the one that I've said, which you say, if our exports are law firms, legal services, and Germany's exports are cars, right, which of course is a huge oversimplification, but to the extent that there is an element of truth in that, you might expect private investment to be less here, because legal services just requires less capital investment than car manufacturing. And I think there probably is at least some element of that. So that's a slightly more optimistic spin. Maybe we don't need quite as much investment as some other economies.
I would just add one thing that the research shows really clearly is that business investment really likes certainty. Certainty in terms of trade policy, regulations, sort of policies more generally. And I think that a lack of certainty is likely to be feeding into those figures at some level.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Swan. I've got the article from the FT in front of me, and it does seem odd that they missed out or didn't include fertility rates, because in Hackney, where I live, we're closing schools. We're closing 4 schools, primary schools, and not just in Hackney, also in Camden, in Lambeth, and that's obviously having a devastating effect on teachers and children and parents. And so fertility rates is a real issue, and people of my sort of age don't and can't afford to have children and stay in the communities they grew up in. So that's really important. Another FT article is talking about how much it costs to build a road in France and how much it costs to build a road in England, and it's 8.5 million in the UK per km, and it's 4 million in France. So that's viscerally the effects in 2 different places.
So on the second point, yes, that's exactly the research I was referring to. It's just more expensive to build stuff here, and that's obviously bad for investment. On the first point, I think there's you're clearly right that one of the reasons people aren't having kids is because it's expensive. It's expensive to have kids, and childcare costs are high. Housing costs are even higher. On the other hand, it's also fair to say, somebody asked me on Twitter this morning in response to this particular point, can you name any advanced economy which has succeeded in sustainably reversing the trend in declining fertility rates? And my, I'm not an expert in this field, but my answer was no, I don't think I can. So this is a sort of problem of modernity and the way that capitalist development has taken place in advanced economies. It's not just, there clearly are UK and indeed London-specific issues here, but it's a wider question than that. It's not at all clear to me what the answers are, though I'd welcome if anyone else has any idea.
Yeah, I would just point you in the direction of there's some really interesting in-depth qualitative research that talks to couples and families about their sort of fertility decisions. And I think the cost of living, not just the sort of past 2 years, but the sort of more protracted retrenchment of public services does seem to be playing into that quite significantly, particularly in terms of childcare coupled with housing costs.
We can take them both. Why don't we take them both? Since the mic is here, let's take them both.
There seems to be an element of self-destruction in government policy, and I think in 2 areas. First, as regards financial services, we've attacked the non-doms. With Ukraine war, we're attacking all the Russian money. There's an exodus of money from London, and a lot of it is a direct result of government policy. The second area I think of particularly is education, particularly private education. The British private schools are a world leader. They've attracted people from the world over who are increasingly saying they don't want to send children to schools in Britain which are entirely populated by non-Brits. And the proposed taxation on private schools is going to exacerbate that problem. I say this because it just does strike me that where there are areas where we seem to be doing quite well, policy is then formulated to attack them.
I wanted to pick up on a finance issue. I don't know whether it's a strength or a weakness, and I merely throw this in as a comment, but the UK, unlike a lot of other European countries and many other countries, not necessarily Anglo-Saxon ones, has a large amount of capital locked up in pension funds. Are there opportunities for releasing or using that money for the purposes of improving infrastructure, between inverted commas, in particular, something which is also rather talked about? Do we have advantages or weaknesses in having a system of retirement funding which is based around that, which could or could not be used for certain purposes? Thank you.
So, I mean, on non-DOMs, we have the country's leading expert on non-DOM taxation and its impacts in speaking on a panel later. So I'm going to punt that one to Aaron Advani. On the sort of more general question of do we run down the things we're good at? I mean, I say I don't want to address the sort of very specifics, but I do have some. I'm not sure I agree with you on the specific policy issues, but I do actually sort of agree with you on the do we run down the things we're good at? And there is a bit of a structural issue there, that the way the political system works does mean that we act in a way that tends to constrain the growth of things that we are particularly successful at, and I have some sympathy with that. On pension funds, I don't know whether you have anything you want to take that one, Sarah.
Yeah, I just going back to the point about UK strengths. I think that's why I think having a clearer strategy on UK services trade would be really helpful. But also I think there are signs that things are changing. So, Labour's announcement today in terms of its approach to financial services, I think is quite interesting in terms of, quite vocal support for that key sector. On pension funds, I mean, that's been doing a lot of heavy lifting, the sort of sense that we could use funds from the pension sector to fund infrastructure. And I think the answer is we could a bit, but probably not as much as policymakers have been suggesting. Quite often sort of shortages in infrastructure finance it's suggested that's going to come from pension funds. I don't think the scope is there quite that much, but I do think there are some opportunities.
Okay, so thanks very much. That's 10:30, so I'm going to call a halt to it then. But just to emphasize again that in terms of the sort of specific issues, we're, I hope, covering most, if not quite all of them, in panels later with subject matter experts. So you mostly will have a chance to get those questions answered later, and I may try to respond to some of the online ones, which I don't have time to respond to now. But thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.